Hey everybody, so I build a lot of geocharts in my Excel dashboards, like this one here. And every time I have one of these in one of my dashboards, somebody asks me, hey, how do I build this in Excel? Here I'm going to go a little deeper. We're going to talk about when to use them, how to use them, what they're useful for, how to style them and make them look great, and just kind of get you pointed in the right direction so you can use them more effectively. Not everyone has access to these. I believe you have to have an Office 365 subscription for the GeoChart or Maps option to show up under the Insert tab in Excel. You can go check right now if you have it. If you do, it's in there and you'll be able to use it. GeoCharts are really, really great looking. They're really engaging, but they are not the most effective way of communicating with your data. They're hard to interpret. You're not really able to interpret how much more of a particular value one region has than another if you just use the GeoChart itself. But man, I've done a lot of A/B testing. I've built a lot of dashboards over the years, and in that A/B testing, I've tried adding GeoCharts and not adding them. And over and over and over again, I get the same result, which is that when there's a GeoChart in there, people use the dashboard more because people just love GeoCharts. I like to use them more as a design element than as a insight tool, or sometimes even as like a UI element, and I'll explain more about that in a second. So what you'll notice across most of my examples is that the GeoChart itself doesn't actually give any insights, at least in this example. It's really providing no information. What I've done is I've supplemented the GeoChart with other chart types to give deeper insights into each region. So this card up here that you see really has all the insights for this region. The GeoChart itself is really there to give us context, kind of let us know where we are and what we're looking at. So an important thing to consider when you're adding in your data for a GeoChart is making sure that you label everything properly. A GeoChart is having to kind of guess what locations you're talking about when you add them into your spreadsheet. If you're working in particular cities, you might need to add both a state and a country alongside it, so 2 extra columns, so that your GeoChart knows exactly which city you're referencing. But that's because there's lots of cities that have the same names all over the world, right? And I think something like 80% of the time when people tell me, hey, my GeoChart's not working, the issue is just that they haven't labeled their data properly. Another thing to keep in mind here is that GeoCharts are not going to work with a pivot table. You're going to have to build a regular table for the chart itself. So if you're using pivot tables, you're going to have to replicate your table. I've done it using just this little formula here that you see for both of these, which is just replicating my pivot table over so that when I change my pivot table, it flows through to the GeoChart table that I'm using. There are a lot of different styling options for GeoCharts. So the first thing I do is I make sure that we have no fill and no line in our format plot area menu. This just makes it so that we're working with a clean chart with nothing showing up behind it. I do this for every single chart I drop in Excel. If you want a chart background, use a shape and then put your chart on top of it. Don't use the default fill and border options that are in Excel. Next, when we actually click into the GeoChart itself, into the data series area, you'll go over to this format data series menu. This is where we get really the more interesting stuff. So your fill and border are going to be the default fill and border for regions that have no data. So if I change this, the only things that's changing are the regions that have no data in them. I personally like to always include a border here because I think it helps you differentiate between the different regions more easily. Let me show you a comparison. With none and then with, I prefer it a lot with a line. It helps us visually distinguish each section. One area that people often skip is this little middle option where we have shadow and glow. I like using a shadow. Shadows in this case just give us this drop shadow effect. If I remove it, you'll see we just have a very flat chart. Play around with the shadow settings until it looks right to you. You can adjust the size, transparency, etc. And now for the most important part. This is our series options. We're just going to go through each of these because it's the most important thing to understand. Map projection is just the different ways it's projected. Just use automatic most of the time unless it's distorting your region too much. Map area is critically important. This is how zoomed in it is. Do I want to show the whole world? Just a particular country or region? Or do I want to show only regions that have data in them? So from a design perspective, this is critically important. I personally use country/region most often because I know I'm going to have a consistently sized element, and if it's part of my overall design, I know what it's going to look like. It just depends on how you're fitting this into your overall design. Next are map labels. You can add these in if you want. I personally use best fit only most of the time or no labels at all. It depends on who your audience is and how important it is for them to know each region that they're looking at. Once you have those in, you can go to the chart design tab, go to more data label options under the insert chart element section. And that's where you can start to decide what you want to put in those labels. If you want to have the value, just the category name or the series name. And you can do things like formatting and all of that here as well. So now we're going to go back over to our series option, and this is where things get really interesting. We have series colors. The gradient style is giving you a couple options. One is sequential. Do you want to have a gradient with one color on one end and one color on the other? So in this example, bright yellow is our highest value, dark green is our lowest value. That's a sequential gradient that we've got there. We can also have diverging. Diverging is going to give you a middle value, which is like neutral, and a lowest and highest value on either end. So we're going to have a 3-part gradient. If you're trying to show something like political leanings, you might have a neutral middle color, red on one side, blue on the other, and then it's going to more effectively communicate this idea that there is a neutral middle ground. This really depends on the data you're using. In my example, I was just using sequential, and I'm going to focus on sequential for this example. A couple tips here. First one, use a very bright color for your max value and a very dark color for your minimum value. If your colors are too close together, people aren't going to be able to distinguish the difference between them very easily. We want to have as much contrast here as we can get so that people just understand what's the highest and what's the lowest. So those are the basics to styling. You're going to have a little trouble with the colors at first. Just practice, do your best. You will get a hang of it with time. The other thing I just want to talk about here before I sign off is the importance of stacking charts together. So here's an example. Now, the GeoChart itself was great, but it just didn't communicate what I wanted to communicate. So I added on bar charts on top. And you see these bar charts, these are just literally sitting on top of the GeoChart. So here's the thing, if you have a data set that has a bunch of different regions like this, you can always just duplicate that table and filter it down to each individual region and drop in some charts on top for each of those regions to give a deeper, more valuable insight. Don't think that you're limited to just using the GeoChart by itself. GeoCharts pair really well with other visualization types like you see here, right? If you're going to be using a GeoChart just to make things look cool to get users engaged, you might as well take the time to add something that gives a little more insight on top of it. All right, that's all for now, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you have questions, let me know below. I'm happy to add more to this and go deeper. I send out some of these in the newsletter, so if you want to actually get a sample file, you can hop on the newsletter. I send them for free with a little tutorial about how to use them, and I'll help get you started. Sometimes it's easier to actually see the data to work with it. I'll be back with more soon. Hope you all like this long form video. Have a good one. Bye.